4:30 in the morning. He was sleeping next to his pregnant wife. The door was broken down. 99 shots. And a silence that lasted for decades. Fred Hampton was not killed. He was executed. By the state. And this story, they never wanted you to know. Fred Hampton was only 21 years old. He was charismatic, intelligent, and bold enough to do what no one else was doing at the time. Uniting blacks, Latinos, and poor whites into one voice against oppression. And for the US government, this was unacceptable. They feared he would become a new Malcolm, a new Martin. But Fred didn't have time for that. Because the FBI got ahead of him. They planted a spy by his side. And on December 4, 1969, they authorized the massacre they're now trying to hide in every way. You've never seen this story told in school, nor on television. Because leaders like Fred are dangerous, even after death. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and activate the bell. It helps the channel a lot. Because as long as we speak his name, he will never be forgotten. Fred Hampton was born in 1948 in Chicago, Illinois. He grew up in a time of deep racial and social tensions in the United States. As a young man, he was notable not only for his intelligence but also for his leadership ability. From his school days, Fred already stood out. He spoke with a clarity that impressed even adults. "I am not a black man, I am a homeless man. I am a man without food. I am a man without justice." These words echoed in his mind, and he used his talent to bring together those on the margins of society. Fred didn't limit himself to theory. He knew that real change came from the streets. At just 21 years old, Fred was already the president of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party. And within the party, he was a revolutionary leader who sought to unite all the oppressed, regardless of race, class, or origin. Why was this so threatening? The Black Panther Party, at its height, wasn't just about resisting police violence, but also about shifting the focus of the struggle to real social transformation. Through programs like Breakfast for Children and free health clinics, Fred demonstrated that the struggle wasn't just for civil rights but for a revolution in the class and power systems. He had an unusual charisma. Fred knew that the key to breaking down social barriers was education and direct action. He spoke the language of the youth in Chicago's suburbs, but also won over community leaders and unions. His Rainbow Coalition, made up of blacks, Latinos, and even whites, was one of the government's worst nightmares. This was Fred Hampton. A man who believed that true freedom would only come through the unity of all oppressed classes. He wasn't asking for favors from the system. He wanted to transform it. When Fred Hampton joined the Black Panther Party in 1968, he wasn't just a follower. Fred Hampton became a top priority target for the FBI. Not because he was violent or extremist, but because he represented a real threat to the status quo. Fred wanted a real social revolution but without resorting to violence. He believed the true weapon of the oppressed was unity. The government knew that if this movement succeeded, it would be impossible to maintain the social order as we know it. The Black Panther Party and Fred Hampton weren't just a military threat. They were a threat to the established power. A threat that, if successful, would forever change the dynamics between the oppressed and the oppressors. In 1969, the FBI had created the COINTELPRO program, with the goal of spying on, infiltrating, and destroying organizations they considered internal threats. Fred Hampton was the primary target. As a charismatic leader, he not only galvanized the masses but also began to be seen as a messianic figure for the oppressed. The government knew that if he wasn't stopped, Fred Hampton could become the leader of a real popular revolution. Until now, you've seen the impact Fred Hampton had on his community and how much he challenged the system. But what happened on December 4, 1969 was more than just a police operation. It was a political assassination, and history cannot be erased. If you're as outraged as I am by what happened to Fred, don't let this story die. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Fred Hampton lives. Let's ensure his legacy is never erased. Fred Hampton wasn't just fighting for black rights. He believed that true revolution would only happen if all oppressed classes united. In 1969, he founded the Rainbow Coalition, a coalition of blacks, Latinos, and poor whites, united by a common goal: to challenge the system that kept them on the margins of society. This idea of unity between different marginalized groups wasn't just radical, it was subversive. In the context of the 1960s, where the country was deeply polarized by racial segregation and police violence, Fred brought a message of unity, not division. He saw racism and poverty as common enemies, regardless of color or ethnicity. The Rainbow Coalition had a clear goal: to tear down what Fred called the corrupt system, which exploited the poor and kept the elite in power. The coalition was built to be a resistance, but not a violent one. Fred believed in the power of solidarity, direct action, and creating real alternatives for the community, like the aforementioned health clinics and food programs. The impact of this coalition was immediate. Through it, Fred Hampton became a key figure not just in the Black movement, but also in the fight for workers and lower classes across the country. He wasn't just a Black leader. He was the leader of a fight transcending color and class, something that deeply scared the government and the established powers. He quickly transformed the Chicago chapter into one of the most powerful in the country. But Hampton wasn't just interested in weapons and militancy. He had a different vision from most of the party members. For him, the real struggle wasn't just against the police, but against the oppressive system that kept millions in poverty and despair. In 1969, Fred founded the Breakfast for Children program. The goal was simple: to ensure that children in the community, especially those from poor Black families, had a nutritional boost for the school day. But the impact was much greater. The program served over 20,000 children a week. It was a clear demonstration that solidarity was more effective than any rhetoric of hate. The Black Panther Party, with Fred Hampton at the helm, wasn't just fighting the system. They were building real alternatives for the community. In addition, Fred implemented free medical clinics for the underserved, helping the poor access quality healthcare. He understood that a sick and uneducated people would never be free. That's why he combined social action with political resistance. The Rainbow Coalition was the peak of his vision. Fred knew that if Blacks, Latinos, the poor, and workers united, they could topple the power structure that kept the country in constant inequality. And that's exactly what the government feared: a unified movement capable of bypassing racial and class divisions. Fred Hampton became a top priority target for the FBI. Not because he was violent or extremist, but because he represented a real threat to the status quo. Fred wanted a real social revolution, but without resorting to violence. He believed the true weapon of the oppressed was unity. The government knew that if this movement succeeded, it would be impossible to maintain the social order as we know it. The Black Panther Party and Fred Hampton weren't just a military threat. They were a threat to the established power. A threat that, if successful, would forever change the dynamics between the oppressed and the oppressors. In 1969, the FBI had created the COINTELPRO program, with the goal of spying on, infiltrating, and destroying organizations they considered internal threats. Fred Hampton was the primary target. As a charismatic leader, he not only galvanized the masses but also began to be seen as a messianic figure for the oppressed. The government knew that if he wasn't stopped, Fred Hampton could become the leader of a real popular revolution. Until now, you've seen the impact Fred Hampton had on his community and how much he challenged the system. But what happened on December 4, 1969 was more than just a police operation. It was a political assassination, and history cannot be erased. If you're as outraged as I am by what happened to Fred, don't let this story die. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Fred Hampton lives. Let's ensure his legacy is never erased. At the height of his influence, Fred Hampton became a direct target of the FBI, which saw him as an escalating threat. But Hampton was not alone. Other leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. had already been targets of COINTELPRO, a secret FBI program designed to spy on, sabotage, and destroy civil rights movements, particularly those led by Black people. The goal of COINTELPRO was clear: to prevent the emergence of a messianic Black leader who could unite the masses and challenge the power system. For the FBI, this meant destroying Fred Hampton. But not with an open and aggressive approach. Instead, the government preferred to operate in the shadows. Through infiltrations, slander, and disinformation, the FBI tried to destroy Hampton's image and weaken his leadership. William O'Neill was the key piece in this dirty game. O'Neill, a young Black man who had been arrested for car theft, was approached by the FBI and, under the threat of imprisonment, infiltrated Fred Hampton's inner circle. He became Hampton's personal security, gaining unrestricted access to the party's meetings and plans. The FBI used O'Neill to gather detailed information about the Black Panther Party's activities and Fred Hampton. He provided the government with the layout of Fred's apartment, which allowed the raid that led to his death to be precise and fatal. O'Neill was ultimately the man who handed Fred Hampton over to his killers. William O'Neill was not just an ordinary informant. He was the instrument of betrayal. Through his infiltration into the Black Panther Party, O'Neill provided the FBI with the necessary information to carry out Fred Hampton's murder effectively and lethally. In 1969, he gave the FBI details about how Fred slept, the layout of the apartment's doors, and even Hampton's daily movements. The FBI used this information to plan and execute the fatal raid on Fred Hampton's home. But O'Neill did not remain immune to the weight of his betrayal. 4 years he remained a silent figure, until in 1989 he was interviewed for a documentary about the Black Panthers. In the interview, he acknowledged his role in Fred's death and confessed that he was tormented by what he had done. O'Neill died in 1990 at the age of 40 tragically. He committed suicide by jumping into a busy street. Some believe he could not cope with the weight of guilt. Others say he could not bear the shame of being the man who killed Fred Hampton, even indirectly. O'Neill became a symbol of how internal betrayal can be as devastating as external violence. He destroyed a life and, with it, destroyed part of the movement that Fred Hampton had created. But even with the betrayal and Hampton's death, the leader's message and his ideas of solidarity and unity remained alive. The truth about Fred Hampton has never been easy to swallow. The government didn't want us to know this. They feared the power of his voice uniting the oppressed. Now that you've learned a little more about Fred's story and the betrayal that led to his death, it's time to reflect. If you believe we need to bring hidden truths about our history to light, like this video, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Fred Hampton lives, and in the meantime his struggle continues. In the early hours of December 4, 1969, Fred Hampton was in his home, alongside his pregnant wife, Deborah Johnson. They were asleep when around 4:30 a.m., a coordinated attack by the Chicago police and the FBI raided the apartment. But the attack was not random. The raid was meticulously planned, thanks to information provided by William O'Neill, the infiltrator. 99 shots were fired at Hampton's house. Fred and his housemate, Mark Clark, were killed instantly. The police claimed there had been a shootout, but evidence indicates that most of the shots were directed into the house, with Fred being murdered while he slept. Fred Hampton himself, who was unconscious due to the sedative put in his drink by O'Neill, had no time or chance to defend himself. The operation was an execution disguised as a confrontation. Fred's death was a clear attempt to silence the growing leadership he represented. As the police, calculatingly, attacked the house, FBI agents, in conjunction, erased evidence that it had been a politically motivated operation. Fred Hampton's body was removed disrespectfully. He was thrown into an ambulance without cover, as if his life was nothing more than a mere statistic. When the news of Fred Hampton's death spread, the reaction was immediate. But not just among his supporters. The Black community was in shock and protest. Fred Hampton was not just a radical militant. He was a symbol of resistance for the poor and marginalized. His death, under such brutal circumstances, sparked an outburst of outrage on the streets of Chicago and other parts of the country. At the time, the media tried to discredit Fred Hampton's image, portraying him as a terrorist and someone who incited violence. But this had no effect. What the government failed to calculate was that Fred was not an isolated figure. His death united the civil rights movements even more, bringing a new wave of protests against abuse of power and police oppression. The Black Panther Party did not remain silent. The organization made a point of denouncing that Fred Hampton was not the victim of a confrontation, but rather a political execution orchestrated by the state. Legal proceedings and investigations began, but somehow, everything seemed to be swept under the rug. The FBI and the Chicago police were never held accountable for Fred Hampton's death. The murder of a 21-year-old leader of such a powerful movement went unpunished. However, Fred Hampton's death had a profound impact. The Black Panther Party, despite being discredited by the media, continued to fight for justice and equality, stronger than ever. But the silence the government tried to impose on Fred was broken. His memory never disappeared. Fred Hampton was not just a leader of the past. His idea of unity among the oppressed and his vision of the need to create real social alternatives still resonate in today's social movements. In recent years, movements like Black Lives Matter and other progressive organizations have echoed the same core principles that Fred advocated. The fight against police violence, poverty, racial inequality, and systemic oppression. Fred Hampton's Rainbow Coalition, formed by different social groups, was one of the first broad coalitions to truly show that the causes of the working class and the struggles of Black people were not separate issues. This influenced the way contemporary activists view the fight for social justice, making solidarity among races a cornerstone in many movements. Even in times when social movements may be diffuse or scattered, Fred Hampton's work continues to be a compass. His insistence on acting locally, caring for the concrete needs of communities such as health, education, and food, is still central to many organizations seeking to transform their communities in practical ways. not just ideologically. Fred's legacy, therefore, is immense, as he was not only a leader of a movement in the past, but also a beacon of hope for current movements that continue to fight for freedom, equality, and justice. After Fred Hampton's death, many sought justice. However, as is often the case when the state is the accused, the fight for justice was long and frustrating. The Black Panther Party immediately denounced the action as a political assassination, but the government's response was a systematic attempt to cover up what had happened. During the trial, no officer was held accountable for Fred Hampton's death. On the contrary, the government tried to silence any genuine investigation. However, lawyers and activists continued to push for answers. In 1971, journalist and historian Jeffrey Haas and others managed to bring the case to light, finally helping to expose the nature of the attack as an execution plan and not a legitimate shootout. Even so, the case was closed and those responsible for Fred Hampton's murder were never punished. This created a sense of impunity, but also the certainty that, if the fight for justice had not been interrupted, Fred would not have died in vain. However, Fred Hampton's death and how the government treated it helped solidify the understanding that systemic oppression does not have just one face, but is embedded in all institutions. At the same time, Fred Hampton's case served to warn the population of how dangerous government abuse of power can be against those who oppose the dominant system. Even years after his death, Fred Hampton remains an inspiring figure. The impact of his revolutionary ideology and his message of solidarity still motivates young activists to fight for social and racial justice. In fact, his vision of a fairer and more egalitarian society has never been more relevant than it is today. Movements like Black Lives Matter and organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, see Fred Hampton as an example of how a leader can articulate not only local struggles but also understand the larger system that oppresses people of color, women, and the poor. Today, community leaders and young activists are inspired by the way Hampton built self-sufficient communities, whether through food programs or health clinics. Fred was an example of how direct action and community organization can translate into real results and positive change for the most oppressed. Fred Hampton, in many ways, is a model of how the fight for justice doesn't have to be centered on a single leader, but on the community as a whole. His idea of popular power has been translated into local organizing practices in various parts of the world. With the rise of social media, Fred's message spread faster than ever. Groups advocating for an end to police brutality, historical reparations for the Black community, and the fight for equality continue to seek inspiration in Fred Hampton's work. Even though Fred's struggle did not resolve in his time, his legacy remains strong. The fight for justice, the fight for rights, the fight against oppression was never about one person but about the power of the people. Fred Hampton's legacy is not just a matter of history. He represents an idea, a struggle for social justice, equality, and solidarity. And in his death, he became a symbol of all those who are silenced by oppression. Fred Hampton knew that the fight was not just against police violence or racism. He knew that the real battle was against the structural inequality that still exists in our society today. In his final days, Fred was a man on a mission, dedicated to creating a nation of equality where everyone, regardless of color or class, could live with dignity. He believed that the fight for justice had no color. It was a fight for all by all. Fred also believed that even in the face of his untimely death, his vision would never die. Indeed, he was right. Fred Hampton became immortal not by his death but by his idea, the power of the united people. His courage, his ideals, and his willingness to fight for a more just world still resonate today. His teachings live on, passed from generation to generation. Even though Fred Hampton's execution was an attempt to silence his voice, the truth is his name will never be forgotten. He was a martyr for the fight for social justice and racial equality. And, in the end, it was he who won, not by strength but by the strength of his idea. An idea that still echoes in the hearts of all those who seek a more just world. Now, you know the truth about Fred Hampton. We know what was done to him and what he truly represented. But his struggle is not over. If you believe the truth needs to be told and that we cannot let the system erase the voices of those fighting for justice, like this video, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Fred Hampton lives, and the struggle continues.